Welcome back. This is now week two, lecture one, part three. And I begin with the rise of Christianity with the slide, the Christianization of Rome or the Romanization of Christianity, question mark. Now, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because some things are going to be very important for the course, this course, when we get there at the beginnings of it, and others are more tangential. So we see here, for example, that the origins of the early Jesus movement. There's a point was who was Jesus, and he's Jewish, but is he different, and etc. It becomes a real problem. The Gospels aren't till later. Um, so we have here the textual traditions of the Gospels. We have Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, which goes back to Mark and oral tradition, a Matthean oral tradition, etc. And then Q and Luke and J and John. There's the dates, so they're later. And the problem was really who was Jesus, and that took a long time for it to develop. Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles or the non-Jews. That was an early debate too between Peter and Paul. And do you have to become Jewish to become Christian or not? It was referred to as the Easter religion at first. And that was the so-called first ecumenical council of Jerusalem, where it's like, no, the non-Jews don't have to become Jewish in order to become Christian. That was a big decision made early on. Still, who Jesus was not established until 325 CE, which I'll get to shortly. And so there is a movement that is spreading and growing rather rapidly. And this whole view of the origins and spread of Christianity and to the Christianization of Rome has been seen as, and was seen at the time as, this great triumph. All of a sudden, the success of Christianity was evidence that it was divinely established, that it was going to be doing, spreading the way it is. Because there were times of persecutions and times of not persecutions, and the Romans thought that Christians were really weird, and on we go. But we have this development and the emerging organization and hierarchy with the institutionalization, the spread of the institutionalization of the church. It appealed to people and made sense to people. It spread primarily at first in the cities, not so much in the countryside. And here's an important distinction too to keep in mind, because people in the country before Christianity, they were called the Pagani. The Pagani were the country folk. That becomes the origins of our word pagan, or also the Christian word pagan, because Christianity spread in the cities, and then it was more slowly in the country. And so when Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome, not to the end of the 4th century, which I'll get to, those people who were not as Christianized were in the country, and they became known as the pagans. So the pagans became known as those who weren't Christian, who followed traditional Roman religion. Pagan, as I said, the Paganus Pagani, was a pre-Christian term, as so much of Christian terminology in terms of the institution that developed was pre-Christian. That was the question of to what extent did Christianity become Romanized? Now, we have it increasing, and it really becomes an issue in the late 3rd, early 4th century, up here, the Roman context. Because the 4th century saw Christianity at first being a persecuted religion, and the end of the 4th century, it became the only legal religion of Rome, where it became, I said, the persecutors. Now, we have to see some of these divisions too. I already mentioned in terms of terminology. The term church, ecclesia in Latin, and ecclesion in Greek, was also a pre-Christian term. It just meant the assembly, the called out community, the gathering. And that became applied to a Christian context. Diocletian, at the end of the 3rd century, becomes emperor. And he says we have to do things differently. Diocletian has gotten a lot of bad press because he instituted was known as the Great Persecution. He says we are going to wipe out Christianity once and for all. Now he wasn't successful in that, but he was a brilliant administrator, and one of the things he did was to divide up the empire into two sections, east and west. I said, you know what? It's too huge. The empire to govern is too huge. So we're going to have two Augustuses, going back to the Constitution. An Augustus ruling the eastern part of the empire and an Augustus ruling the western part of the empire. They will also both have a vice Augustus who will be called a Caesar. So you have Augustus and a Caesar for the west, an Augustus and a Caesar for the east. It's called the Tetrarchy, broken into four parts. The major division, east-west, and then under each Augustus was a Caesar. Now, Diocletian kept kind of the primacy as the chief Augustus. Now, just as Octavian Augustus, when he gave back all power to the Senate, he kept one office for himself, the Pontifex Maximus, so that he would be in control of Roman religion. Now, that being said, 303, Diocletian proclaims a great persecution. Romans thought the Christians were weird. All kinds of stories about how perverse they were. They had orgies. They had child sacrifice. They worshipped the head of an ass. It's like what? You can see where this was coming from. I mean, one of the stories in Luke is Jesus rides into Jerusalem, or it's also in Matthew, on a donkey, on an ass. So it's like there's misunderstandings there. And they called their meetings agapes, love feasts. And this one 3rd century source says, my God, not only are they just having orgies, but they turn it into an incestuous because they call each other brothers and sisters. And so they're sitting here having these love feasts, these orgies with calling each other brothers and sisters. It's like a Roman didn't have any problems with orgies. But incest, yeah, that was not really part of the Roman moral code. So you can see why it was seen as problematic. Now, the Jews were also problematic for Rome. But they kind of worked out a rapprochement of how to live together. At least some factions of the Jews did. The Pharisees, the Sadducees. There were still more radical aspects, but that's getting back to the time of Jesus himself. I'm not going to go all the way back there for that. I think I talk about that in the Myth of the West, so you can read it there. But Diocletian said we have to get rid of them. Now the problem was by the early 4th century, or the turn of the 4th century, Christianity had gotten so big. There's a sociologist by the name of Rodney Stark who wrote a book called The Rise of Christianity. There's numerous books called The Rise of Christianity. But what he did, because Stark's research was on, let's say, new religious movements. He said, what we know from new religious movements is they could have anywhere from a 2% growth per year to a 7 or 8% growth per year. So let's take a conservative figure of 4%. And let's take a very conservative figure in terms of the number of Christians in the year 50 BCE. Or CE, sorry, CE. And let's do just a simple arithmetic progression. 4% growth every year. Slow, and it begins to be towards the 4th century, and then it just takes off. So that by the beginning of the 4th century, he said that that progression would be that there would have been approximately 10% of the population would have been Christian. By the mid 4th century, that had gone up to over 50%. Just by simple arithmetic progression. Now, he's not saying that is how it happened, but he's saying that we can understand it without having to appeal to this divine miracle of the success story of Christianity. If Diocletian had lived 100 years earlier, he may have been able to wipe it all out, but he didn't. It was too big at this time. And he also created martyrs, which is not a good thing. And he saw after 2 years that it wasn't working. And he called it off in 305. Called it off and retired. He and his co-Augustus retired, abdicated. Now, that left then a power vacuum. And there's fights for succession. To make a long story short, the Caesar in the west was a man by the name of Constantius. He became the Augustus in the west. And then a new Caesar was chosen, but everyone expected it to have been Constantius' son, but it wasn't. He was ignored. So when Constantius died very shortly thereafter in battle, his troops hailed his son as the new Augustus. His son's name was Constantine. Constantine had to fight for his power and authority. Finally did. He has marches on Rome. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge at 312 was outside of Rome. He was not a Christian at this time, but he had a vision, according to tradition. The vision was this sign of a cross, or there's a couple different versions, either the sign of the cross or the Chi-Rho, which is the first two Greek letters of the name Christos, the anointed one. And he heard the words, "In this sign conquer, in hoc signo vinces." He will conquer under this sign. So he had his troops paint the cross or the Chi-Rho on their shields, went in, won against his opponent in the Milvian Bridge, established himself as the ruler of Rome, and as the Augustus of the West. Augustus of the East was further east. He finally defeated the emperor in the East too, so he became the sole ruler of Rome. Now, what did he do? Constantine. He did not become a Christian. That's one of the big myths. Constantine is seen as the first Christian emperor. He was not the first Christian emperor. It's debatable whether or not he actually converted on his deathbed or not and was baptized. It may very well have been that he was, but there's no evidence that he, quote unquote, became a Christian himself before then. Even though after his victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he began to favor Christianity, and he proclaimed in 313 the Edict of Milan that Christianity was legal. It would no longer be a persecuted religion. It would no longer be illegal to be a Christian. And he starts supporting Christians. Part of that, too, is, but what do Christians believe? He wasn't really sure. So he said, we need to get all the Christian leaders together to decide and determine what it is that Christians believe. So he calls for a council to meet in the Greek city of Nicaea in 325 CE. And they do. It's the famed Council of Nicaea. And what do they do at Council of Nicaea? A number of things. Number one, they condemn Arius. Arius was a priest, a Christian priest, who taught that Jesus was a human being who was then divinized, like Julius Caesar. Divinized and became the Son of God. Had a special relationship with God all along, but he was a human being. That made a lot of sense to people, because that was something that was a classical mind could understand that and accept that. But the classical mind could not accept this doctrine of the incarnation. That was the problem. But at Nicaea, they asserted that Jesus was fully God and fully human. Homoousios, of one being with the Father. And they formulated what's called the Creed, the Nicene Creed, which is a statement of faith. Credo in Latin is I believe. That's how the creed starts out as credo. In Deum unum et omnipotentem. I believe in one omnipotent God, etc. And that was formulated at Nicaea for the first time, an official statement of Christian belief in the creed. Then two, it said, okay, what are the Christian writings, Christian scriptures? They've been passing around, they've been in circulation, different versions. There's all kinds of other gospels that were circulating and being passed around. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, another book, the Acts of Pilate. All these, and what is the actual Christian scriptures that is divine revelation? That was determined at the Council of Nicaea. They gave up a list of books called the canon that would be official Christian scriptures. They also said, and the Jewish Bible, the Hebrew Bible, will also be part of that, because that too was a debated question for quite a while, whether what Christians call the Old Testament should have anything to do with Christianity or not. And that was decided to, yes, it does. That's part of Christian scriptures. We're one and the same thing. It's just the continuous revelation. And here we go. So they set the canon. They define Christian doctrine. And those are big issues. Big issues to take care of. And then they condemned Arius. So those are the major aspects of the Council of Nicaea. It was to have a huge impact. Because once doctrine is defined, it became distinct from heresy. Now, heresy is a Greek term, heresis, before Christianity. It originally meant just what form of Greek philosophical thought you follow, what school of Greek philosophy you followed was your heresis, your choice. With the increasing definition of Christian doctrine, beginning with the question of who was Jesus of Nazareth, heresis became then in opposition to the correct teaching, the correct proclamation, or orthodoxy. So we have that distinction now that hadn't really been there before between orthodoxy, correct teaching, and wrong teaching, or heresy. And Arius, the Arian position, was proclaimed to be a heresy. Before then, it wasn't. Now, let me say right here and now, a couple of things. The Arian position remained very popular. We see this shortly. The Germanic tribes, at least some of them, became Arian Christians. Constantine, people have said, scholars have argued that he kind of lended towards the Arian position, but he followed what the Council Fathers determined, even though he calls the council. This is an imperially led, and he oversaw the council, oversaw the defining of doctrine and the defining of the creed by imperial authority. Orthodoxy had imperial backing. Now, another pre-Christian term, bishop. Bishop is an overseer. In Latin, episcopus. Pre-Christian term, episcopus. Diocletian, not only did he then divide the empire into these four parts of tetrarchy, he also further subdivided the empire into administrative units called dioceses. An episcopus was in charge of a diocese, an overseer of a diocese. That was a pre-Christian term. But when Christianity starts taking over these administrative functions within Rome after Constantine, who does away, of course, with the tetrarchy, he is the single emperor of all of Rome now, and he has proclaimed Christianity to be legal. And so these administrative offices of the episcopacy, or the bishops in charge of a diocese, became Christians. And that was how the church was organized too. So he kept Diocletian's administrative developments and innovations for the institutionalization of the church. To another issue of, did Rome become Christian or did Christianity become Roman? That's not like one or the other. It's kind of both, but I think it's important to ask that question and see the extent to which Romans, once they became legal, simply adopted, or Christianity, once it became legal, simply adopted Roman administrative structures and made them Christian for themselves. Church, bishop, diocese, etc. Chief priest. Became Christian concepts and offices and administration. That's important. But even with Constantine, you could also be a pagan, and Constantine also supported traditional Roman religion. We have letters from him, requesting help, and he helps them too, even though he favored the Christians because, again, Battle of the Milvian Bridge, source of his power. Now, Constantine did something else besides the Council of Nicaea. Was to have significant impact. In 330 CE, he moves the capital of Rome, the capital of the Roman Empire, from Rome to his own city that he establishes, the city of Constantinople, which is further east in what is today Istanbul. Now think about this for a second. When Constantine moves the capital to Istanbul, to Constantinople, in 330, Rome is no longer the capital of the Roman Empire. Now, Constantinople was in a predominantly Greek-speaking territory. That's one of the things we see, too, in the course of the 4th century developing, is an increasingly divisive linguistic split between Greek and Latin. It had been, and it still was in the 4th century, more or less, at least early 4th century, that if you were an educated individual within the empire anywhere, you were bilingual in Greek and Latin. That bilingualism became then increasingly divided between East and West, where it was the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. Not completely, but we're moving in that direction. And Constantine's moving the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to Constantinople just accentuated that increased linguistic division between Greek and Latin. Major issues. But then what happens after Constantine? After Constantine, every emperor after Constantine was Christian. We said Constantine maybe was baptized on his deathbed, except for one, Julian the Apostate, was one of Constantine's grandsons, I believe it was. And we then get to Theodosius at the end of the 4th century, because Theodosius was the last emperor to rule the United Empire under his own imperium. He rose to power after Rome was beaten by the Goths, a Germanic tribe we'll hear more about shortly, at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, and Theodosius comes in to try to deal with the problems with the Goths, who were fleeing the Huns, and it gets to be really messy, and I'll be talking a little bit more about that very shortly here. And between 391 and 394, Theodosius issues a series of decrees proclaiming Christianity to be the only legal religion of Rome. It was no longer legal to be a traditional Roman in terms of religion. It was illegal not to be Christian. And this gets to the point, too, of then therefore became illegal to be a heretic. Because if you're a heretic, you're not following the Orthodox teaching, which is how Christianity is being defined. Now, Orthodoxy was very slow in coming, and always was throughout this course. Very few doctrines were defined definitively once and for all. And then we get in the issue of dogma and doctrine, and I guess I'm not going to go into that too much. But the issue is that this is a state issue. And with Theodosius, at the end of the 4th century, you could be punished it was a crime against the state not to be a Christian. The church never burned any heretics. The state did. And the number of heretics that were burned throughout most of this course were very few. They didn't really start burning heretics until the later Middle Ages, which we'll get to. It's always been overblown of how many heretics were put to death. But we'll get there when we get there. But we have to come to understand that it is heresy is a crime against the state. I'll come back to that again and again, as will I'll come back to the issue of Constantine having moved the empire to Constantinople. Major developments. Before he dies in 395 CE, Theodosius divides the empire east and west between his two sons, Honorius in the west, Arcadius in the east, along the lines of Diocletian. He didn't reestablish the tetrarchy, but he still just has two Augusti, Augustus of the west and Augustus of the east. The empire then is split east and west. Roman emperor in Constantinople, Roman emperor in Rome. Just like the two consuls of the Roman Republic. Not that big of an innovation, but it was to have major impact. Now, that brings us then to what comes thereafter. So after Theodosius, the splitting of the empire and the quote-unquote barbarian invasions. I already mentioned the Goths, Battle of Adrianople. The Goths were a Germanic tribe. Now, we're talking about the Germans. They were known, but we're talking about a linguistic community of very different groups. The Germani. There were many different Germanic tribes north of the Alps and also then east, north and east. They also come from the Caucasus Mountains. They came over, and it's very unsure how all these groups were migrating. The Goths were one such group, and the Goths had arranged with Constantine to settle within the confines of the empire and become kind of confederates of the Romans. They became basically Roman citizens. Some of them. There are different groups of Goths. And by this time, by the early 4th century in Constantine, the empire was so vast, and the definition of citizenship had so expanded to being any free male, completely divorced of ethnicity, so that the numbers of citizens had mushroomed. And the definition of who could be a citizen had mushroomed. Still, not every inhabitant could be. The slaves could also, Rome was a slave economy. Slaves were not citizens. Women were not citizens. Children were not citizens. But adult males were. Basically, every adult male became a citizen. And so there's no ethnicity that is then Roman at this point. And we have this horrible term, the barbarians. So often we hear about the barbarian invasions. Oh my God. That's why I have that up there in the title of this slide in quotation marks, the barbarian invasions. No such things. These were migrating Germanic tribes. And they're called Germanic because of the linguistic similarities of their language. already in the first century, the end of the first century, around 90 or so CE. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote his great book called De Germania, which, when I teach my early medieval course, that's one of the things I assign when we go through it. It's an amazing book, and it's a great insight into what was going on in terms of the Germans. Now, the term barbarian goes all the way back to the Greeks, because the Greeks consider themselves to be the only basically civilized people. And if you didn't speak Greek, you were lesser. And so the Greeks distinguished between themselves, the Greeks who spoke Greek, and those people who did not speak Greek. And those people who did not speak Greek sounded like they were saying bar, 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 bar. They became known as the barbarians. At first, even though being a barbarian meant you were not Greek, still it wasn't a pejorative, except for not being Greek. Herodotus writes his great history of the Persian Wars, which goes all the way back to the Trojan War to begin. He says, Herodotus of Halicarnassus wants to write, this history of these wars, lest the great deeds of the Greeks and the barbarians fade into oblivion. The great deeds of the Greeks and the barbarians. The barbarians were simply not Greek. That became, though, applied to the not Roman, and then eventually to not Christian. So the term barbarian is a loaded term. How many of you would say you're a barbarian? I'm a barbarian. We still see it as the civilized and the barbarians. The civilized and the pagans, the pagani, the country folk. It's this dichotomy that has been there since the very beginning of civilization, which I talk about in the earlier chapters of the Myth of the West, if you're interested. They're not assigned, just 4 through 9 are assigned. 4 through 6 for this week, 7 through 9 for next week. But earlier stuff's there. This dichotomy is between us and them. We are good, they're a potential threat. Perhaps a potential ally, but still a potential threat because they're not us. Who becomes us? Well, we have to be careful, because if we allow people to become us or with us, not just allied to us or with us, that changes our identity. That changes who we are. Who are we, after all? And there's where history comes back in as important. The history of a people, of us. Now, that is this concept between the barbarians and the invasions. They were not Roman. They were not educated in Rome, except some of them became educated in Rome. There's a Goth in the later 4th century by the name of Wulfila, who was the first bishop appointed to the Goths. Wulfila was Gothic. He was a Goth. He had been educated in Constantinople. He was fluent in Latin and in Greek. And he took his pastoral role as bishop to the Goths very seriously. He thought one of the first things we need to do is to provide a written language for the Goths so they can read the Bible. And he developed a Gothic written language. Now, Gothic was a spoken language, but Wulfila devised a written language for the Goths. Some of the Goths became Christian. Some of them became Arian Christians, but still Christians. Now, we have these Goths and the Germanics, and most of the Germanic tribes were not Christian, Arian or otherwise. But some were, and those who became confederated with Rome had to be at least Arian Christian. Now, how does that fit with heresy being a crime against the state? It wasn't that strict at this point. Yes, the Council of Nicaea had defined Christianity in a particular way, and the Arian position was seen as heresy, but yet they're not trying to establish uniformity yet. And at least the Arians still accepted Jesus and still were Christian, even if they were wrong about some things. Now, the leader of the Goths, who were associated with Rome, was a man by the name of Alaric. He was a Roman general fighting for the Roman Empire, leading his own troops of Goths. And he was having problems with the Senate because the Senate was not providing him the funds to pay his troops. That's the other thing in the structure is, the general who had Imperium was responsible for his troops, and he paid them. And you don't want to have a bunch of unpaid troops being pissed off. It makes it difficult to lead. So what did Alaric do? What did Sulla do? What did Caesar do? He marched on Rome. And in 410, he brought his army into Rome to try to assert his right as a Roman general that the Senate wasn't paying attention to. Now, what does an army do when it invades a city? It does what it always has done: rapes, pillages, and plunders. And this was called the sack of Rome of 410. It was a shock. It was the first time Rome itself had been sacked since for like 800 years. We have to go back to like the 370 or something like that BCE. I often refer to this as kind of their 9/11. Why? Because what was so shocking and impactful about 9/11? Yeah, a lot of people died. Over 3,000 people died. Okay, yeah, it's a lot of people. If that had happened somewhere out there, we wouldn't care. We were attacked on our soil, which we had not been since Pearl Harbor in World War II. That was what made 9/11 so impactful. What made 410 so impactful? This is Rome, my God. Even though, now we have two capitals, Rome and Constantinople. This is part of it. It's sacked in 410. How do we deal with this? And all of a sudden, chaos breaks out, and we have Christians saying, we were sacked because this is divine punishment. We have not been Christian enough. We've not been sufficiently Christian. We have pagans, then, traditional Romans saying, no, were we sacked? Because we've become weak. We've become Christian. And no wonder we're attacked because we're weak. And that's not Roman virtue, turning the other cheek. It's not Roman values. So we have some people damning Christians for the sack of Rome. We have Christians damning themselves for the sack of Rome. What do we do about it all? Because all of a sudden, this triumphalism that was there with Christians, especially when Theodosius proclaims Christianity the only legal religion in 391, this is like fantastic. We've made it. And then 19 years later, the sack of Rome. And it's like, what? Were we wrong? Augustine of Hippo answered those questions in what he referred to himself as this great and arduous work, the City of God against the pagans. He started writing it in 413, doesn't finish it until 426. I could spend a lot of time talking about Augustine. I'm not going to. There's a chapter, I think 5 it is. This assignment this week is one of the longest chapters in the book, if not the longest, and that is all on Augustine. He's one of the people I study and his influence and impact, so I know a lot about him. So I'm not going to begin to start talking about him, except I wanted to say that, yeah, the chapters assigned, you should know some of these things. And the fact, too, that in his dispute against the Donatists, which I'll leave for the textbook, the Donatists were determined wrong in the Council of Carthage, and Augustine won the day. He just thought that they would say, "Oh, okay, we'll join up with you." Well, the Arians had done that when they were condemned at Nicaea. Neither did the Donatists, and so Augustine finally comes about and says, "Well, if they won't join us of their own volition, once the imperial legislature, Marcellinus, had determined that who won the debate, Augustine and his faction, if they won't voluntarily join us, they must be compelled to do so." How are they compelled? By Roman military troops. It's the first argument we have for the use of military troops to enforce religious conformity. with the Donatists. So after Carthage, the Council of Carthage in 411, and in 413, Augustine then responds to the sack of Rome in 410. He says, too, they were, they weren't as bad as you might think because they did spare Christians. Yeah, they were heretics, but still. Now, again, I'm not going to go into Augustine, but that is what was going on, and this 410 begins to mark an ongoing, I can't say invasion, but an ongoing conflict in the western part of the empire, which by this time is predominantly Latin speaking, of these Germanic tribes making incursions into what had been under the imperium of the emperor in the west. It had been before that under the imperium of the whole thing. So when Augustine himself dies there in North Africa, he's North African. I mean, he worked in Rome and lived in Rome for a while, and then in Milan, and then he goes back to Africa, North Africa, in Hippo. When he dies in Hippo, the Vandals, another Germanic tribe, are sacking the city. Things seem to be pretty dismal. Honorius, through this divided Rome between Honorius and Arcadius, what do we do with all this? He was pretty weak. The Bishop of Rome, who remained Bishop of Rome, and kind of the titular head, at least he claimed himself as the titular head of Rome. After Constantine moved the capital, Constantinople, the bishops of Rome started proclaiming themselves as the ruler of the western part before it was ever split again. And Pope Leo I was argued very strongly how the Pope was the primate of the West. Petrine doctrine. How the Pope, and the Pope is just means in Latin is Papa. Papa, actually father, daddy. But it's translated as Pope. But Papa Leo I wrote letters proclaiming the Pope as the true successor of St. Peter, the rock on which Christ builds his church. And this we see the beginnings then too of this eternal empire that was Rome becoming Christianized. And this whole aspect of the Petrine doctrine and supremacy is going to be a major influence throughout the rest of this course. And this finally brings me to the slide that Rome never fell, transformation of Europe. I have here then the historiographical context, Edward Gibbon, because there was never a concept of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire until Gibbon, Edward Gibbon, who was an English Enlightenment historian, wrote his magnificent 5-volume work on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. It's a classic, and it's brilliant. I think he's wrong, but he's still as brilliant. After Gibbon, that phrase, the decline and fall of Rome, has stuck ever since, and people accept it as an actual event, usually associated with the last Roman emperor in the West, who was deposed in 476, Romulus Augustulus, the little Romulus Augustulus Romulus. Because at this time, the acculturation of the Germanic tribes within Rome had become so thorough. We have just up here too, that second point, the Germanization of Rome and the Romanization of the barbarians, quote unquote, or of the Germans. Just like with Christianity, you couldn't really even tell, even people, let's say traditional Romans who lived in Rome, who were thinking themselves as pure blood Romans, were very skeptical even of Diocletian because he was, not really Roman. And for a time in the 5th century, there was a couple times where, a Germanic chieftain, who is a Roman general, almost became emperor. And so there's all this process of what is Roman and what is Germanic and what is barbarian, everything we go. And finally, Odoacer, who was one of these Germanic leaders and kings associated with Rome, finally said, you know what? Romulus Augustulus is worthless. So he writes to the emperor in the east. And I'll tell you what, how about I just get rid of this guy? I will rule the west for you. And the emperor in the east is cool. Okay. So Odoacer packed up all the regalia, the imperial regalia, sent it to Constantinople. And the emperor of Rome now was, again, a single individual in Constantinople. They'd seen that before. That was Constantine. But then we have what happens thereafter. I'm not going to go into all the details because it's very complex. But there's one group I do need to talk about, and that's the Franks. Because the Franks were, again, this group, this Germanic group, one of the Germanic groups in central, what we call today Central Europe, Transalpine Gaul, northern Transalpine Gaul, nothing else. They were in that area, and their king Clovis became the first king of the Franks. So there was different Frankish groups, the Ripuarian and this Solarian. What's the other one? I forget the other name of it. But under Clovis, they were unified. And what made Clovis so special and important is he converted to Roman Christianity, not to Arianism, to Roman Christianity. He did so, according to the sources, after a battle. Supposedly his wife was Christian, Bavarian princess. Bavaria is still a Catholic stronghold. She was after Clovis. Come on, you should convert, to Christianity. He goes, you got to be kidding me. But before battle, he was then losing. He was losing a battle. And he was praying to his gods. They weren't doing anything. So he finally says, I'm going to pray to you, Jesus, and the God of my wife. If you help me win, I will believe in you. At that moment, tide of the battle turned. The Franks put their enemies, other Germanic tribes, to flight, and Clovis won a great victory. He therefore became Christian, Roman Christian. He was baptized, and he had everybody baptized. That's one of the things, too, here. We talk about conversions. I'll be talking more about conversions later, too. I think next week or so. What did it mean at this point to become Christian? It meant you were baptized and you attended Christian worship. That's it. Gregory of Tours was a Christian bishop of Tours. Has this amazing work, which also I assigned in my early medieval course, History of the Franks. They were bloodthirsty people. They could tell all kinds of fantastic stories, which are fun to tell. But these were good Christian people, according to Gregory. Not that they were morally good, but Gregory was not a moralist. Gregory just saw that they're important for Christianity. So you shouldn't do things like that, like kill your own kids because or have your kids killed because it's all kinds of fun stuff. All kinds of fun stuff. If you want a great read Gregory of Tours. But this association of the Franks becoming Roman Christians was to have a major impact. Now, one of the terms I'll be talking about shortly, I believe, is on midterm 1, is the Franco-Papal Alliance. This was not the Franco-Papal Alliance. I'm getting there very shortly. But it's the beginnings of it. Because all of a sudden the Franks are supporting Rome. And Rome, therefore, supports the Franks. This was to have major impact from there on out. Which does bring me to the Franco-Papal Alliance. But before I get there, here is this next map of the Roman Empire, approximately when it's divided up after the deposition of Romulus Augustulus. So you can see, it's not what it had been, right? Not what it had been. It's losing territory. Now, And maybe the Franks. I've already talked about Gregory of Tours, the history of the Franks. I've talked about Clovis, the unification, the conversion. Now, Clovis was from a Frankish family that traced his heritage to a mythological figure that may have actually lived, named Merovec. So they became known as the Merovingian kings of the Franks. And this next map there shows their territory around 639 CE, because Clovis was able to effectively govern and expand the territory. They said the Frankish territory, he unified all the Franks and they kept it kind of expanding. And so it becomes, it says dynasty, we can call it an empire. It becomes an empire north of the Alps under the control of the king of France. The Franks, I'll come back to that in a second. More extensive than had been since before Romulus Augustulus' deposition in 475. And when I said come back to that in terms of the kings of the Franks, they're always infighting. Clovis divides it all up between his sons. His sons are infighting, and it becomes a god awful mess, to be quite honest. That's a real problem. But the later Merovingians, this gets to the Franco-Papal Alliance. The slide, the later Merovingians kings became known as the Do-Nothing Kings. They enjoyed being king. And they finally appointed a new office, the mayor of the palace. And Charles Martel was the first mayor of the palace in the early 8th century. And it's kind of like the prime minister. I mean, the mayor of the palace was actually, the person who was going to be governing, whereas the kings just sat around and didn't do anything. They called long-haired kings because they saw their hair as a source of their power and authority, kind of like Samson in the Hebrew Bible, modeled after. And they had another problem with it when Charles is appointed mayor of the palace, namely the threat of Islam. Because we have the rise of Islam. Muhammad dies in 632 CE, and Islam spreads. If we see this next map here, we can see the spread of the Islamic empire, the different caliphs. And so it becomes an issue of the Franks being kind of in Rome and Constantinople being surrounded and threatening because they had spread from where they originated throughout northern Africa into Spain and were coming further west to continue. That's the problem there. And what happened? Charles Martel, at the Battle of Tours in 732 CE, also known as the Battle of Poitiers in 732, led Frankish forces and repelled the further advance of the Islamic forces. So they stopped the further incursions of Islam into what we call Europe. Big deal. And Charles Martel's son became mayor of the palace after Charles. His name was Pepin. Second Pepin, also referred to as Pepin the Short. Pepin was a very capable ruler. He realized, it's not right. I'm not king. The king is a bozo, kind of like Odoacer with Romulus Augustulus. But rather than writing to the emperor in the east, Pepin writes to the Pope. It says, "Dear Pope, I have a question for you." Now, we do have these letters. I'm paraphrasing. Very much so, paraphrasing. But the essence is there. Because what Pepin kind of writes, "Dear Pope, hey, I have a question for you. Who should be king? He with the title or he with the power?" Love, Pepin. P.S. I hear you're having problems with the Lombards. Now, the Lombards were another Germanic, quote-unquote, barbarian not Christian, tribe in northern Italy, making incursions in Rome, down to Rome and stuff. And the Pope was left trying to defend against the Lombards. What do we do? So the Pope writes back, says, Dear Pepin, thank you for your letter. I've given it quite a amount of thought. And my view is that he should be king who has the power. Love, the Pope. P.S. Yes, I am having problems with the Lombards. Can you help? So, with that papal sanction, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, proclaims himself king of the Franks, and then leads Frankish forces into Italy, across the Alps to defeat the Lombards, at least temporarily, and establishes a buffer zone of central Italy to say this is the Pope's territory. Became known as the Papal States, as a territory ruled by the Pope. Now, if any of you have ever been to Rome, you probably have either heard of or know of, or maybe if you haven't been to Rome, you've heard of or know of the Vatican and Vatican City. Vatican City is an independent sovereign state within Rome. Has its own post office, has its own police force, Swiss guards, has its own everything. There's ambassadors to Vatican City, as well as to Italy. Imagine that expanded to all of central Italy, basically. That was the Papal States established by Pepin for the Pope in 754, Franco-Papal Alliance, whereas the Franks become the defenders of the papacy officially, and the papacy becomes the defenders of the Franks officially. There's a union there, an alliance. And the Pope is temporal ruler of central Italy. This gets to be a major, major issue. Now, where are we here? Now I have the emergence of the Carolingians, because once Pepin proclaims himself king of the Franks, he is a new dynasty. No longer the Merovingians. He gets rid of the Merovingians. Going back to Charles Martel, he's from the family, his father, he's from the family of the Carolingians, who come from Charles Martel through Pepin. We'll see further on how that goes from there on out. So this Franco-Papal alliance, what really took place between 751 and 754, was the Franks coming to the aid of the papacy, establishing the Papal States, and the Pope coming to the aid and giving legitimacy to the Carolingians, to Pepin, to be king of the Franks. Worked out very nicely indeed. Now, that kind of brings me to one of the last slides, the emergence of Christendom. Once Clovis converted to become Roman Christian, the Frankish realm was a Christian realm. You saw earlier in the slides the map of the Frankish dynasty, the Frankish realm, the Frankish territory, the Frankish empire. It became a formidable political entity, and it became the basis for what we call Christendom. We'll be talking more about Christendom next lecture, the next week, I think it is actually, because scholars have argued, this is not my argument, that at this time and throughout most of this course period, when we find in the sources the term Christianitas, we should translate it not as Christianity, but as Christendom. Christendom was a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. I'll repeat that. Christendom was a geopolitical entity defined by the boundaries of Christian worship. It has nothing to do with morality. It has nothing to do much more with belief than that. But it becomes the new myth. It becomes the transformation of the myth of Rome, whereby the myth of Christendom becomes identified as this divinely sanctioned empire without end, whose limits will know no bounds. And that we will see developing further, not in the next lecture, because I think that's on monasticism, but next week's lectures leading up to the first midterm with Charlemagne, who was Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, Karl der Grosse in German, Pepin's son, Charlemagne, who was crowned then by the Pope in the year 800 CE, Roman Emperor. I'll come back to all of that. This will be setting the stage for where our course, beginning around the year 1000, kind of starts off, but we'll get there when we get there. Thank you for your patience. Made it through these 3 parts, and I hope that, again, that will be shorter versions next time. Thank you so much, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.